Cool. So, Zohran, it's great to meet you, and I'm really excited for this conversation. Um, I wanted to start by just asking, how things are going and what you're up to right now.
So things are going well. It is exciting and exhausting all at once to be in Albany and to be a legislator. I would say you have about 10 days left in the legislative session. And so there's a mad dash to pass all that is good and to stop all that is bad. And these last few days have been a combination of the two. So Uber and Lyft have been trying to push through legislation that would basically codify the second class status of drivers and deliveristas across New York State. And so we've been fighting with everyone in our body to stop that legislation. It seems promising, our fight to stop it, but it's not yet won. And then the things that are good is that fighting to pass a bill that I introduced in the Assembly this year to ban all new construction of fossil fuel plants. And so trying to push that through in these last 10 days.
Nice. That sounds exciting, but also really stressful. And the bill that you guys are trying to stop has just been like really concerning to read about. Yeah. So I wanted to talk to you about Palestine. And I guess where I wanted to start is possibly unexpected, but basically really just in the present and the now and the future. And then we can like zoom out from there about the larger issue. But, I think like many of us have been following this issue, obviously for decades as, the ongoing apartheid continues, but also in the last couple of weeks or few weeks with the uptick in violence and, targeted attacks of Palestinians, the bombing of Gaza, and now even these like mass arrests of Palestinian citizens in Israel. But I think, what I want to ask you about first is this concern that I think a lot of folks are having right now about, this issue is very quickly fading from mainstream attention post the ceasefire. But obviously the ceasefire doesn't mean an end to the siege. It doesn't mean an end to settlements or to discrimination. And so I think a lot of us are thinking right now, how do we keep the pressure on? And like, how do we keep this movement going? How do we keep talking about this? And I wanted to ask what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I think that it's a great question to ask. And I think that it speaks to the fact that we have to let reality dictate the attention as opposed to media dictate what we care about and when we're responding to things. And the reality, as you said, is unchanged. It's apartheid today as it was apartheid yesterday, as it was apartheid a month ago, and far before that. And I think that the way to ensure that people continue to pay attention to the horrific cruelty that is in many ways being done in our name as Americans, we have to organize, and we have to also make it clear what the tangible local connections are to this struggle. Because oftentimes it's easier to keep something out of mind if you don't feel yourself in any way connected to it. And so when I say organize, I mean, thinking about continuing to put together mass actions, continuing to show symbols of collective solidarity, and make it clear that just because we had 5,000 people show up at Times Square and 10,000 people in Bay Ridge and maybe even more in Sunnyside last weekend, that those people have not gone anywhere. That feeling of solidarity has not left us. It continues to exist. And in fact, it's a solidarity that is understanding that the cruelty of what is happening in Israel, in Palestine, it is a cruelty that is systematized and does not simply rise and fall when the IDF decides to kill men, women, children, and families beyond the binary in Palestine in different moments of spikes. With regards to tangible local actions, I would say that making it clear that it's not just that our tax dollars fund Israeli oppression, it's also that our city and state governments have partnerships with Israeli municipalities and the state, and that we can hold our governments accountable by really going after those partnerships and really spotlighting them and with the goal of dismantling them. I think that when I think of partnerships, I think of how the NYPD and the IDF have had a relationship for many years, a relationship that has meant, tactics of oppression crossing from one country to the other, and that has meant an increased, surveillance and oppression of marginalized people wherever they may be. And I think that the Jewish Voices for Peace had a spotlight on this relationship, and that's one thing I think that we can bring up. And there are many other examples, sadly, of this kind of relationship.
Yeah, thanks. So I want to come back to the collective action aspect of it and kind of like how we can, come together in solidarity to like push for these changes. But one of the challenges that I think in thinking about some of the things that you just brought up is that I feel like when it comes to this issue, we're obviously not starting from like a neutral place of like trying to bring this global catastrophe to people's attention that we should be focused on, but really like starting from a negative of the fact that, our tax dollars are invested there, our state and local governments have partnerships there, like across industries on like different sorts of like structures of power. The powers that be have this like unwavering support of the state of Israel. And there's this like intense level of disinformation that's been rooted through these ideas like Israel's the only like democracy and bastion of freedom in the Middle East, and like this dehumanization of Palestinians that has been like so rooted in the American psyche that all kind of feels like it has to be unlearned before we can even start to push for positive change. So like, how do we even start to do that? Like I feel like we're starting from like 10 steps back. And it sometimes feels difficult to even start to dismantle that. And so just like even on top of that, and it's a whole separate conversation with the fact that like even the mere criticism of the state of Israel can, elicit targeted harassment or accusations of anti-Semitism. So with all of that sort of like cards stacked against us, where do we sort of begin?
I think that we begin by looking at how things have already changed this time around, because the response in New York City and across the United States of ordinary people has been one that just filled me with immense hope. I really got into organizing through the Palestinian Solidarity Movement. I co-founded my school's first Students for Justice in Palestine in college. And the same people who used to walk by me in the student union when we were organizing for an academic boycott, those same people have reached out to me since to say that they wish that they had gotten involved and that they feel differently now. And that in many ways, the Black Lives Matter movement has opened up their eyes and so many other people's eyes as to the reality of state violence and the interconnectedness of state violence. And so I think that obviously we have a very long way to go, but it's important for people to look around and see a real resurgence and a real growth in the popular understanding of justice, and the fact that to fight for justice is to fight for Palestinians, and to fight for Palestinians is to fight for BDS, and to do all of these things is to critique the state of Israel and to critique the Zionist project, and that the conflation of Zionism and of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism is a conflation that it seeks to distract, it seeks to delegitimize, and really what it is an attempt to silence. And we have to be clear about it. And there have been immense costs paid by many in engaging in this struggle and in this movement. And I think that to see so many be cognizant of those costs and still come out and fight is it really just fills the heart and fills the soul. I think that you were asking, how do we really start to reckon with the fact that we're 10 steps behind, and how do we take action? I think that you take action in every which part of your life. So for example, I'm a New York State legislator. Every year they introduce this resolution commending Israel's Day of Independence. And this year, like every other, it was introduced and it was scheduled to go up. And I called the central staff of the assembly and I made it clear that if this resolution were to come to the floor, I would speak in opposition to this resolution and would speak about the reality of what was happening in Palestine. Now, the resolution has yet to come to the floor. I'm not declaring any kind of small victory in any way, but I think just the fact of registering opposition, that business as usual cannot continue any longer. And it is so, so important that we do not cede any ground to apartheid and to supporters of apartheid, and that we be unabashed in our criticism of it. And I think that what's so exciting is that unabashedness, that courage, it's contagious. And so many other people will see it and draw upon it as a well, and then use it for themselves when they fight this in their workplace. Whether it be Associated Press reporters who have written to the Associated Press about their dismay and disappointment in the ridiculous firing of a journalist because of her membership in SJP in college, or some tweets that she may have done since, or it be members of the Biden administration who have written to the president to say that we really need you to hold Israel accountable for its crimes. I think these are things, that the one upside of how interconnected our government and the Israeli government is that there is no shortage of options of places you can take action. And it's important to make it clear that you don't have to go to Gaza to stand with Gaza. You can stand with Gaza by taking action right here in New York City.
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting to hear. I also got like my start in organizing in my college's SJP as well. And I feel like it's a really good, sort of like nurturing space to like gains that knowledge of solidarity and intersectionality, and going through, really grueling battles for divestment and like all of that. And I also, work in a media space, and I'm constantly sort of worried about backlash and worried about, the witch hunt, like finally getting to me. But I think I and many others, as you mentioned, have felt that like this time has sort of felt different. And obviously a lot of credit goes to Black Lives Matter movement for the language that they've given us and the movement that they've given us around solidarity, around, highlighting injustice and like state sanctioned violence wherever that exists. But, as we try to continue building those movements and being intersectional in our approaches, what do you think is kind of the best approach at like getting others to understand that aspect of solidarity? Like what kind of language can we use? Or like, I guess, how do we sort of mobilize people to understand that like, as much as they might feel like this isn't something that they're personally connected to, that like we are really all invested in each other's liberation?
I think that it's important to make that case on a moral level. And sometimes that means really explaining the stark nature of apartheid in Israel, and what it means to have separate laws for separate people, and whether that means like visualizing checkpoints, visualizing roads that you can only drive on if you're Jewish, things of that nature. That those images and those stories for many people are very arresting. And I have friends who's really have, in seeing the images of destruction and displacement, have changed their views on what's going on. Because for so long, really what the Zionist project continues in part because of propaganda and because of a monopoly of information in so many mainstream sources. And so when people see the reality of things, it can create a shock because they've never actually been exposed to it before. So I think there is that moral argument to be made. And then I also think there is the argument of connectedness in a kind of, straightforward, as a New Yorker, how much of your money is going over there and how much of your needs are unmet over here. And in the same way that when we talk about defund the NYPD, the entirety of the push is defund the NYPD and refund all of these different social services and things that actually create safety. And so I think that when we need to connect the struggles against austerity with the struggle against the funding of Israeli apartheid. And I think that, when we talk about these connections between the NYPD and the IDF, when we talk about state funding for Cornell Technion on Roosevelt Island, when we talk about different ways in which we have invested in apartheid and what is being left out as a result of that choice, I think it has the prospect of animating people. And the other thing I would say is that, you know, developing this kind of internationalist solidarity is it's not a new project. It's one that we thankfully are able to inherit from years prior, and really tapping into the ways in which our ancestors made it clear that the struggle for one was the struggle for all. And I think that also means that when there are struggles for other issues that we may not be as well versed in, or maybe even as passionate about, but we understand them as struggles against injustice, we have to show up and make it clear that us as SJPers, or us as, you know, supporters of Palestinian liberation, joining arms and supporting these other movements, because you cannot ask of others what you do not give yourself. And so I think that that's also an example that we should show.
Yeah. So one of the things that you mentioned was, you know, being able to approach this issue in your own sphere, whatever sort of industry you work in, whatever sort of community that you're in, being able to go about it in, you know, your sphere of influence. And I wanted to shift focus a little bit towards that sphere of influence for you, which is, you know, being in a space of government, being an elected official, where, you know, so much of that like connection is apparent, whether it's at the federal government level or even at the state level. Yeah, I wanted to ask, like, when you see so many of the sort of like ties that are being established at this sort of government structural power level, how do you try to begin to, you know, broach this issue or try to like undermine that connection as it exists in the government?
I think the first step of that battle is uncovering just how deep the relationship is. There's so many pieces of legislation and, you know, examples of institutional support that we don't even know, because there's a full apparatus that has been built and that operates to support anti-BDS legislation, pro-Israel partnerships. And I don't mean like, you know, some shady other world. No. This is very clear. We know exactly what organizations do this. You know, we're talking about APAC. We're talking about, you know, so many other organizations that are very well funded and that have a very clear mandate to pass this kind of legislation across the entire country. So I think the first thing is uncovering what the legislation that already exists is and what the legislation that has been proposed and continues to be proposed is. Then I think it's important to showcase to colleagues how we are not the ones introducing the international sphere into state politics. This has been done many years prior, and now we're simply responding to it and asking that our response be consistent with our values in state legislative matters. And pointing out the hypocrisy and the inconsistency, I've found, is something that is very helpful, because, you know, in the time, and as you know, as an SJPer, you know, the phrase PEP, progressive except Palestine. And you'd see this point at which the point at which there was a border where people's cares for justice and dignity and human rights seemed to just end and submit in totality to whatever the demands would be of the Israeli state. And making it clear to everyone that those days are over and we need you to showcase consistency. And if you do not showcase consistency, there has to be political consequence vis-a-vis how we operate in elections. Because I think that that's the other difference, is that this time around, there's also been an element of consequence that was introduced here in New York City. I can speak to in the mayoral race. You had Andrew Yang and Eric Adams both release horrific statements about what was happening and what continues to happen in Palestine. And unlike in years prior, there was immediate consequence for them. So for Andrew Yang, he was uninvited to a food distribution event that was put together by a good friend of mine, Javed Bai of the Astoria Welfare Society, and he publicly uninvited him. And Andrew Yang had to deal with that reality when he was asked by a reporter in Astoria Park about why he wasn't at his publicly released schedule, as had been said, and why he was instead in the park. And then he was, you know, accosted by a number of Astorians, members of my district, who spoke to him about their absolute displeasure in his remarks. Eric Adams was uninvited from an event in Coney Island that I think was being held by the Pakistani community. And the fact that for the first time, these politicians were having to be on the back foot about things which in previous years was just, this is the way it works. And now we're making it clear that these are choices that you're making, and these choices will have consequences. So I think that that's how I approach things internally, and an allusion to that. And also for me, I'm very excited about being a member of DSA, specifically the New York City DSA chapter. And DSA, for those who don't know, is Democratic Socialists of America. And within the questionnaire, when you submit to be considered as a candidate to be endorsed by the organization, you're asked what your views are on BDS. And I think that that has also brought what is typically thought of as a separate issue into the sphere of local politics, where we create a bench of candidates who we're not legislating on BDS on a daily basis, but it's clear that our commitment is unabashed to justice and it's universal. And that whenever the moment is there, that we are ready to stand in solidarity. And so it makes it clear that every single place where power exists is a place that we are committed to standing with the Palestinian people.
Yeah, definitely. One of the things I think that we often hear a lot of on the left or in activist spaces, organizing spaces, is this kind of belief that within the realm of politics or within the realm of government, that like these structures have really just been created from the outset to defend structures of power. They're rooted in settler colonialism, and there's really no like, that they just by definition cannot be the root or the source or the like way that we're going to achieve progress on these issues. I'm sure that you probably are not one of those people who thinks that, because otherwise you wouldn't be in this position. But I think you also kind of allude a little bit to, how then can we use this space for power? And it seems like a lot of that really depends on organizing from the bottom and like holding people to account. That like we can't really just depend on like individual folks in government, that like the worker solidarity, the folks, in our communities, they have to be the ones who are really pushing for this.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. And I would say that we can't expect anything without organizing for it. And I think that I respect that there are many differences of opinion about the value of electoralism, the value of engaging with the state. But I do think that as long as the state has this monopoly on violence, then we have to contest the state at every which point and every which place. And there is an opportunity to have our voices heard within the state. And obviously, by becoming a member of the state in terms of its political class, you are compromised because you're legitimizing it in many ways. But I think if I didn't see the ability for us to claim victories from the inside, then I wouldn't be doing this. And I know that there are those who disagree, but I do think that so long as there's power in any place, we have to contest it. And I found that when I was first getting involved in politics, there was a fetishization of purity that could be achieved by separation from power. And I find that to pursue that avenue is one that actually leaves those who are oppressed even more oppressed without any hope of a defense happening at every which level. So that's why I made the choices that I made.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like, given this sort of tension that exists between those who are in these like establishment political spaces and sort of wield the levers of power or are adjacent to it or kind of like close to those levers, versus those who are kind of by definition excluded from mainstream power and, organizing from the bottom. As you mentioned, I feel like there is often this sort of like purity concept that keeps them very like separated, or kind of on like both ends, a sort of like deep mistrust of the other and like a belief that the other can't really accomplish the end goals in the way that like we can, whether that's through electoralism, through the system, or like kind of from the outside. And I mean, I'm personally someone who believes that like both of those need to work in like lockstep to achieve anything. And I'm curious how you feel like we can kind of bridge that gap to, like work more collaboratively between those in electoral positions and those kind of organizing through worker solidarity, through collective action, through labor, to like push each other and achieve those goals.
Yeah, I totally agree with the framing that no one can be successful on its own. I think that you need that lockstep, and I'm not really interested in like a supremacy ideology of electoralism over other means of struggle. And I think that one thing, to go back to DSA, what's so exciting is that there are these different working groups. You have electoral working groups, you have housing working groups, you have labor working groups, you have all of these different groups, eco-socialists, that are committed to the same struggle, but oftentimes through different means. And then there are these moments in which they come together. Sometimes it's campaigns for to elect, comrades. Sometimes it's in the fight against Amazon. And I think that these different moments of our greatest victories, those are only achieved because of the work of every single one of those groups together. And I think that the other thing that I would say is that it's critically important that anyone who seeks to be a part of elected office and become a part of the state in this active way has to be accountable to organizations that are not purely made up of those who believe in the state as the only way by which you can make change, but also composed of individuals and collectives that operate in a dual power mindset of building power inside and outside. And I see DSA as that. I do not think that we have a monopoly over this method. And I think that any organization that does it is one that's worthy of being joined and being a part of. And I think that when I think of the greatest victories in Albany's this year, I think of the Excluded Workers Fund, a fund that was created for undocumented workers who are locked out of unemployment at the federal level and at the state level. And what this fund would do is provide some modicum of relief. And this fund was won in many ways because of the pressure brought by those that the state doesn't even recognize, the state doesn't even see. Without the pressure from those individuals, members of the state would never have taken this action, because nothing happens because of benevolence. It happens because of pressure, as you know. And these workers made that very clear in the way that they organized and the victories that they won.
Yeah, definitely. And how do those things kind of like come together, or like what's the meeting point when it comes to, like, as we observe, like there are DSA, members of government, and then there's DSA working groups that people are involved in and organizing through. Where do those two things sort of like intersect when it comes to translating the work of like the organizing into the more electoral space?
I think that's a continual project that we have. So this is the first year we have a number of different members in the state legislative bodies, 4 in the Assembly, 2 in the Senate, that are all endorsed by the organization. We have a couple other people who are members, but they're not formally endorsed. So the ones that are endorsed were part of a group called Socialists in Office. Every Friday morning at 9 a.m., we have our weekly call for an hour and a half. I have a biweekly call with the Eco-Socialist Working Group, a biweekly call with Queens DSA's Electoral Working Group. And these meetings are different methods of accountability. And this dream of Socialists in Office as a collective, of which we have the weekly call, is to operate as a block, and a block that's not simply composed of the electeds, but also composed of the organization and the organization's goals and representatives of those. And so I think that that is a way that, that's the dream, is how do we bring all of these things together, and how do we ensure accountability that is collective as opposed to accountability that is just constituency based, and based, on election by election, but to a larger ideological movement. So what I'm trying to say is it's a work in progress, and we're 5 months into it, and there have been great victories. There have been, very difficult moments as well, but this is something that we're committed to, and something that we're actively working towards how to continue to formalize it and expand it.
Mm-hmm. So I feel like a lot of the, like, I guess beyond like BDS, when we think about like solutions or we think about organizing on this issue, I think oftentimes it comes down to like sort of electoral things and trying to like push our members of Congress to like support a bill or be against some sort of like action that the government has taken. One of the things I feel like was maybe new, maybe not new, but that I heard about for the first time this time, was a lot of like really like on the ground worker run direct actions. Whether that was, the general strike that happened in Palestine, or even, here nearby to me in Oakland, they like stopped the shipment of the like Israeli products. And so how do you feel like on that level through like a working class social like solidarity and like collective action level, we can keep the pressure on or like take action, direct action on this issue.
Yeah, I think that that's critical, and that the ways in which we can marry our struggle to our day-to-day life and show our solidarity in that life, I think that's critical to winning this fight, because it can't all be, as you've very well stated, just kind of exclusively considered a legislative battle. It has to be a society-wide battle. And I think that there is no thing that's too banal to stand up against the brutality of the occupation and apartheid. And so, you know, it's if it's a shipping container, or if it's a university that's being funded, a university that helped to develop IDF's weapons technology, or if it's, you know, an event with an Israeli ambassador, whatever it may be, I think that we have to showcase what that solidarity looks like. And and it also helps to highlight just how intertwined this oppression is, and just how much it relies on us normalizing it and saying that, you know, my convictions stop at the point when it becomes inconvenient. And we have to showcase that convenience means nothing in the face of these things. I sadly have to run off, but I just in a few minutes, but I do have to go soon.
For sure, yeah. I just wanted to wrap up as well. Wanted to just end with one last question, asking you about, you know, as we look forward now from this sort of like challenging place of, you know, worrying about this possibly leaving our sort of mainstream consciousness, but like wanting to keep the pressure on a personal level, how are you sort of planning to, I guess, keep fighting the fight in your sphere that you have?
On a personal level, I am very much committed to actively working to stop any additional anti-BDS bills that come through the Assembly. Also been working on a letter to circulate to support, you know, proactive measures that we can take to stop apartheid and to hold Israel accountable, and to make it clear that New York State electeds stand with congressional leaders who are seeking to do just exactly that, and helping to put together protests that continue to keep public attention on this very issue. And it's really exciting because, you know, my predecessor was somebody who very much marched in support and showed up at press conferences in support of the Israeli state. And I am somebody who's unabashedly in support of Palestinian liberation. My constituency hasn't changed that much in between our terms, but it's very clear to me that my constituency now, after I've said these things, the response that I received is just overwhelmingly in support. And so there are so many other people, so many other districts in New York City where people are just waiting to be given the go-ahead to express that solidarity. And that's why the organizing of events, that's why the statements of support, they're so critical, because many times people are seeking permission to fully believe in the thing that they suspect. And it's my job to give them as many opportunities as possible, and to push as many other colleagues of mine and people in any place of power to do the same, because I really do believe that we have not yet hit the ceiling of support for the Palestinian people's fight for justice.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much, Zohran. It's really exciting and like promising to see the work that you're doing. And I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me.
Thank you so much. This was so lovely.
Yeah, thanks.